Coming up in this video, I'm going to show you how I paint a 3D printed dragon miniature. Welcome back to Mini Junkie, everyone. My name is Jarrett. In a recent video, I went over some miniatures I was sent by Daniel Herrero from 3D Printed Tabletop, and in it there was a dragon, and the dragon was unassembled. It came unassembled, and I put it together and I filled the gaps and whatnot, but I ended up painting the Nothic instead for the actual video. But there were a few comments asking if I would paint the dragon, and I decided that yeah, I mean, it's an awesome miniature, it'd be a waste to not paint it. So I set about planning how to do it. It's meant to be a green dragon, I believe, and it has a name which I will mention in the narration of the painting because I don't have it in front of me. When I post this video, there should be a few days left in the Kickstarter, which is called The Lost Adventures, and I'll link to that below. So you still have a chance to get in on it, get a whole bunch of awesome 3D printing files for, and actually PDFs and adventure, kind of like all-in-one adventures. So it's a really awesome Kickstarter and you should check it out. The one challenge so I wanted to try some new techniques, even though I've kind of tried them before, but I wanted to try using the Colorshift paints again on this one, and I decided to also try using some artist inks that I've been seeing people use, like Goobertown Hobbies and Marco Frizzoni, I believe is his name, on his channel. They've been using artist inks to really great effects, so I wanted to try them out. So I ordered a couple from Amazon. I'll link to the ones I bought below as well. They're Liquitex brand. But with the Colorshift, I knew there'd be a risk of it looking like those iridescent sort of figurines you sometimes see in gift shops. Like, I'll put up a picture of kind of what I mean. They look a little, well, they're okay, but they're a little cheap. And there was a risk of this dragon turning out like one of those and just looking like a gift store dragon, and that's not necessarily what I wanted. So I had to do a few things differently to separate it from that if I was going to use this sort of color shifting paint, and you'll see how I did that. If you're new to the channel and interested in this hobby and learning more, just consider subscribing and click the bell notification so you don't miss any videos. Oh, I should point out I made a lot of mistakes painting this guy, and I will probably show them in the video, so you'll see the process I go through of taking something that I think I'm effectively wrecking and figuring out how to recover and end up with something that I was pretty happy with. Let's go to the painting table. So here is a look at the finished product. I'm really happy with how this turned out in the end. I think it looks super cool and not entirely like a gift shop dragon. And it was a really pleasant miniature to paint, and once the gaps were filled and everything, it's just a terrific miniature. So I started out with what I knew is I wanted the inner membranes of the wings to not be color shift, and so I would need to prime those in a way that wasn't going to get covered up later. So then I primed it white and then covered as best I could with masking tape. It's not perfect, and I knew that, and I would fix it later. I sprayed the base with Umbral Umber from P3. I didn't bother showing that. Then I used a gloss black from Vallejo. I'm not saying it right. In the past, what I've done is done a black prime and then glossed over that, which is okay, but I think using an actual glossy black primer is ultimately going to be more effective, and so I'm glad I picked up a bottle of this stuff finally, because I'll use it for future, potentially even certain metallic effects like chrome and whatnot, and certainly for doing future color shift projects. So I pretty much just sprayed the entire dragon with this. No magic here, just getting a nice even coat with the airbrush. And here he is. This is what he looks like when he's covered in the gloss all over. You'll see the camera shake somewhat now and then in the video because I don't have a great setup for airbrushing and I keep bumping it. Here's the different color shift metal paints, and I was considering Emerald Getaway or Storm Surge Green, and I kind of felt like Storm Surge Green was probably going to be too bluish, and I wanted certainly this to be green. Here's that test card I used before. In this case, here's the Emerald Getaway, and here's the Storm Surge Green, which actually looks quite yellow in the video, which is interesting. So it's a very, very pale green. For the underside and parts of the tail, I decided to use Scale 75 Peridot Alchemy, which is a fairly greenish looking gold color. This was going to be pretty sparing, just some of the exposed part of the tail, which is at the end where it goes past the scales, and a little bit of the underside and the underbelly. And I just airbrushed this right out of the bottle. It's pretty neat stuff because you'd think it's too thick, and yet, and I don't know how to thin it because water wrecks it, and I don't. So maybe just airbrush thinner, but I just sprayed it and it comes out really nice. And not splattery or anything like that. So straight up airbrushed onto there, and not trying to be super neat because I knew I was going to come back and have a little bit of blended over, overlap from the Colorshift paints when the time came. In this step, I just took Emerald Getaway, shake it up really good. I believe it actually comes with a metal ball agitator inside the bottle because you really do need to agitate these really well. So I think they come that way. And just my airbrush on a slightly lower PSI. It was probably, I don't know, 15 or 20 PSI. And you're supposed to apply this in thin coats and allow it to dry between coats. And I've always been just an impatient painter, and certainly with these on smaller miniatures, I haven't been great at letting them dry between steps. This miniature being as large as it was, by the time I got through covering each area all the way around and throughout the dragon, the previous, the initial steps would be dry. So then I just keep going and just sort of go from one end to the other, applying it probably 4 or 5 coats when all was said and done. Spraying from above a little bit, trying to avoid the gold, that peridot alchemy I had used previously, but I wasn't too worried if it covered a little bit. I'm getting way more chill in my as I get older, and I'm not as fussed about getting perfect lines, especially when it comes to an organic creature like a dragon. But yeah, just all the wing finger bone thingies, and spraying right over where I had masked it, and just cover the whole thing. Depending on the angle I was airbrushing at, it's a little hard to show you some of these steps, but in this case I took that peridot alchemy again and decided to do the larger sort of wing-based claws with that kind of maintaining that metallic green theme. So the claws that you see sticking out both the front and the back parts of the wings, and yeah, just airbrushed it on. Kind of knew all along I wanted his face to stand apart from the rest of the Colorshift look, and I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to do that. So for the first time ever, I'm trying this Liquitex white ink. I kind of love it. I love how it sprays. I love how it comes out and has nice opaque coverage without getting lumpy and drying on the tip really quickly and splattering. Certainly white is really bad for splattering on airbrushes most of the time. And I hoped that this treatment of the face would, be part of my journey to not making this look like a gift store dragon and making it look more like an actual creature you might want to put on a tabletop. So just carefully and gently, as I immediately burst some onto his face as I say that, just applying it in thin layers, thin coats, letting it dry, moving the airbrush a little bit, probably not as much as I should have. And I'm actually blending that into the body of the neck, so to speak, because again, not trying to be precise, not wanting an actual hard delineation between the face and the neck. When that was dry, I took green Liquitex artist ink, or acrylic ink, here you see, and same deal, I airbrushed it very carefully and slowly over all the white I had just done, once that was dry. Kind of dig how this looked. It almost looks metallic once the green was starting to dry. However, it was also going to be fairly flat, right, without any shading, and I was sort of trying to think about how I was going to deal with that while I was doing this. But in the end, I was happy with this step for a little while. I go on to work on some other bits for after this, and that bright green face was looking pretty cool, but eventually some things happen that I have to change it, and you'll see. So leaving the face for a bit, it was time to tackle the wing membranes. By the way, sometimes with a dragon or a similar winged creature, you would paint the membranes to look more like thin and as if they go through both sides. In my case, I painted these a little differently because they're quite thick, and it just didn't seem right that they would be, thin membranes between the segments. So anyway, that's what I did. Just peeling off this is Tamiya masking tape, works quite well for this type of hobbying. Peeling it off and very much aware that there was, black and color shift that got in around the edges, because it just was difficult to mask perfectly on those inner membrane sections. To paint over those, I probably could have used white paint. I think I was just feeling a little obsessed with this ink, trying this ink in different ways during this. So just right out of the bottle, just painting it on. It goes pretty well. It covers pretty well. It's a bit thinner than paint, and I guess I don't have too much to say about it, but it seemed to work okay. I did like that it was a little easier to get it to kind of run into the very crease between the membrane and the finger wing bones that I will never know what to call those. At this point, I'm starting to flail a little bit. I would say I take some Minotaur ghost tint from Badger. This is green, and airbrushed it on. Not worrying too much about getting a little overspray. And it's tough to see in the video, but it very easily and quickly was pooling and rippling and just making streaks and not going on nicely. So I decided fairly quickly that, and obviously I could have reduced air pressure. I could have maybe tried to back up a bit more, but then you're really going to get the tint all over the place. So I couldn't really do that either. So I needed to stay in a little bit close. And I did apply it all over, but not super thrilled with how that looked. So then I decided, well, what if I take that green ink I was using and spray that over top of this? Don't know. At this point, I'm just grasping at straws. And this was also kind of starting to ripple and pool very quickly out of the airbrush. And I don't have any great excuse for this. I could have tried to find a way to make it work, but I just kept going, and I was getting kind of annoyed that this wasn't looking great. Even though it's sort of working, I just wasn't thrilled with how it was looking, and I knew that those ripples and folds needed to be more shaded, and I was going to have to figure out how to do that. So for the face and the wings that needed some shading and depth to them, sorry, I'm zoomed in a lot here because I want you to see what was happening. I'm using Beal-10 green from Games Workshop, and the wash was taking the ink off. I think you can probably see it here. Right down through the white, you can see dark spotches on his face there. And then here, it might be a little harder to see, but even just a little bit of brush stroking was starting to take the green ink off and show the ghost tint underneath. It was creating splotchiness. So I couldn't work the brush and the shade much because it was stripping off the green acrylic ink. So I'm obviously going to need a little bit of more time of learning how to use that acrylic ink properly. So you can see under his eye there's like that dark gray blotchy area. That's the ink coming off from this wash, which I didn't really understand why this wash would take the ink off. Maybe I just didn't let it dry long enough because, again, I'm an impatient painter. I decided to let that dry for a while. I was frustrated, and I'd deal with it afterwards. And I took some of the deep violet acrylic ink, and this step I'm actually quite happy with. I decided purple would be a neat way to shade these greens. You can see the Beal-10 wash was accumulating at the end of the wings sections. Ugh, just messy. Anyway, so I sprayed these into some of the just slight folds in the wings just to create a little bit of a shadow, and then eventually also working around some parts of the body, some of the, between joints and a little bit under the neck and areas like that, just to create some visual interest and some different tones. Because I don't know, I always hear about purple being a cool way to shade colors, and this actually turned out pretty nice. So in my quest to figure out the face and highlighting it, I decided to try some worm green from P3. It has worm in the name. Seems like it might be suitable for dragons, and it probably is, but it wasn't the right tone to highlight this green. You can kind of tell it just doesn't look right. And it just, I don't know, because I was getting frustrated, I wasn't exactly trying hard to make it work either. I wasn't doing a great job on the actual brush strokes. And so I applied it for a bit, and then I just kind of threw in the towel on this color because I could tell it just wasn't looking right. Then I had an epiphany. What if I took the other green that I hadn't used, Storm Surge green, and used that on the wing membranes and on the face, and maybe that would be different enough to help them stand apart from the rest of the body, but also look like it fit this animal, right? Like it fit this dragon. And so at first I started spraying it on, and you know, you're supposed to obviously do this over a black glossy coat. But I was like, just whatever. I'm spraying it right over, and it actually works out okay. It actually ended up looking quite nice, you know, with lots of thin coats, applying it very carefully through the airbrush, and covering just that face area where I had all the green, and then eventually, my kids are home, so I'm gonna have to stop here. And then the membranes, and you'll see how I do that. And then I think that was the trick that pulled this all together, was to use this color on the face and on the membranes. Clean things up a bit, I went back with the Emerald Getaway and just kind of tried to airbrush it onto, you know, you can see here that it got some of the Storm Surge on the inner finger wing thing, so I tried to put that over top of that a little bit. I'm not sure if that worked. And then I also sprayed it over some of the purple areas so that the purple would still be showing like on the backs of the wings, but it would, you know, it just kind of soften that a little bit, so you still had the shading, but it wasn't quite as stark. I think this next step really adds a lot of character to the dragon in his face by airbrushing Liquitex Deep Violet ink upwards at an angle so that it's catching the undersides of like his jaw, his cheekbone, ridges, etc. And I really like how that violet ends up shading that light, you know, bright green of the Storm Surge green. So I think this step really helped to really add some character to his face. You can see here I did also go and spray a little bit of that purple in around some of the bases of the horns and whatnot, just trying to, you know, really just creating some visual interest and some variety. Then I came in with Ushabti Bone because his teeth, I decided, needed to look like teeth and not metallic, so really basic step, a little bit of thinned down Ushabti Bone, just carefully painted over the larger fangs and the teeth on the inside. Then once that's dry, I just hit it with a little Agrax Earthshade to create some shading between the teeth. I kind of deleted that segment because it was pretty simple. I did think it was important for his eyes to stand out, and the face is already pretty bright now, so I used white. I used white primer here through a couple of layers to create a nice bright white eyeball, which I then am going to come back and tint later. But first, the claws, I did those. This is my lazy way of doing claws on a lot of different figures. I just paint them black, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in with some Ard Coat from GW, which is just a really strong glossy varnish, and I'm just going to make them look like shiny black, which I think looks cool on a lot of figures. And I did extend that treatment to the smaller sort of bone talon thingy sticking out of his arm in a few places. I almost used red as a glaze over the white eyeballs, but decided to use this contrast paint, Griffin Orange. I think it looks cool. It's almost like a fiery eyeball and still is bright. And then it also, I think, contrasts well with the green tones, green and purple really, but the green tones of the dragon look good with like the orange. And here's the Ard Coat step I mentioned, where I give the dragon a bit of a pedicure, and I just apply this in a big thick gob over each of the talons, and it creates a nice shiny effect on them. And here's the finished dragon. Painted the rim of the base black, threw on some tufts and some flowers. I think the flowers are from Green Stuff World. Really happy with how this turned out. I did struggle here and there, as you saw, but what I found is quite often a miniature will go through a point where it's really not coming together, and you just have to persevere make a few decisions, and usually it'll come together in the end. Once again, thanks to Daniel for providing this miniature for me to paint. No Patreon, but if you're enjoying my videos, or this video in particular, and you want to hit me up with a tip, you can click the tip jar link below for PayPal. I'm hoping to save up some cash to pick up a microphone for my iPhone and do some on-the-spot voiceover, because my current setup doesn't allow for it. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.